Thank you for inviting me. I come from one of the countries in Eastern Europe that struggled for democracy 28 years ago, when the communist regime collapsed, and that now are questioning themselves on whether this struggle was successful, and if not, why. In '89, I was among the young students that formed the first free student organization in 40 years. We struggled for a new constitution that would allow a multi-party system, free elections, free speech, and respect for human rights. In '91, I started working for the central news of the Bulgarian television, and since then, I have never left the field of journalism, which obviously changed my perspective. I started reporting on the way the new constitutional provisions were implemented and on the way other people continue to struggle. And what I see from that perspective, 28 years later, is far from what I expected back in '89. Formally, the main goals are achieved. Bulgaria is now a member of NATO and the European Union. Our freedoms are constitutionally guaranteed, and even if we are the poorest country in the European Union, we have the fourth growth rate of the GDP in the European Union. So technically, we live in a democracy with a poor but with a growing economy, and like Germany, for example, we even have elected for a third time the same conservative government, a repetitiveness which could be seen as a sign of political stability. But nevertheless, something is terribly wrong with our values. The more we look stable, the worse are our achievements in the field of constructing a true civil society. And I am here to speak about this discrepancy. Let me give you several examples. Bulgaria is the worst country in the European Union in terms of freedom of speech. According to Reporters Without Borders, we are ranking on the 109th place among 180 countries in the world. This has not been like this in all of the 28 years after the collapse of communism. In the 90s, Bulgaria ranked among the 41st countries in the world in terms of freedom of speech. So something wrong has happened with the press precisely in the period when and after Bulgaria entered the free world, becoming NATO and EU member. What has worsened as well is the perception of the corruption, the perception of the quality of democracy, and the perception of justice. And what was clearly proven at the same time is that all of these poor results were not related to the new political orientation. On the contrary, Bulgaria is still among the countries with the highest levels of confidence in European Union. We just don't have any anti-European party or movement. What Bulgarians do not trust is their own government, which has an average approval under 10%. So how is that possible to be a formal democracy, a reliable partner for two of the most powerful organizations in the world, with no free media, with highest corruption levels, lowest perception of justice, and let me add one more alarming survey, 86% of the Bulgarians do not participate in any form of civil organization. They don't join NGOs, they are not in the charitable organizations, they are not in any form of organized life. But this is a state which lives in a democracy. I have an answer to that discrepancy, but that answer is different from the one I had back in '89. In '89, in the times of velvet revolutions, I believed in a change that would come with a responsible government and change of laws. Today I see that what undermined our efforts is what we underestimated the most, the education. Paradoxically, the education was a heavily unreported field during all of these 28 years, when personal political struggles and gossips took over it in the main medias. And what happened meanwhile is that Bulgarian education didn't follow the political evolution of the country and never introduced civic education, while at the same time it stopped teaching a large part of the history of 20th century. The last part is the most sensitive issue for many in Bulgaria. What we struggled against in '89 was communism, with its brainwashing precisely at schools, or with its lack of free movement and free speech, and the total replacement of the free will with an ideologically motivated participation in civil life. But almost 3 decades later, this is precisely what is missing from the history textbook in Bulgaria. Usually, that whole historical period of 45 years is reduced to several sentences, and many of the biggest crimes of the communism are even not mentioned as crimes. What is missing as well is the complicated Bulgarian politics during the World War II. As we all know, Bulgaria was a Hitler ally, but the country managed to save the lives of its Jewish population. At the same time, Bulgaria has deported to Treblinka more than 11,000 Jews from the occupied territories in Greece and Macedonia. So this dual participation in the history of World War II is not commented in the textbooks. And here are the catastrophic results that we face now. 50% of the young Bulgarians between 15 and 35 years say that they know nothing about Auschwitz. 40% say that they know nothing about the Bulgarian Gulag. And 42% say that they are not okay with the description of Stalin and Hitler as dictators. So let's combine this with the lack of civic education, and we will end up with a whole generation of young citizens that easily would become victims of today's populism. We cannot expect anything less with a generation that has grown up without any knowledge of the darkest periods of 20th century that erased for years the very conception of democratic values. Thank you.